Welcome back to The Shadows by George MacDonald. When we last left our friend Ralph Rinkelmann, he was in conference with the shadows at their church in Iceland. He grew thoughtful again. The shadow was the first to resume. "Please, your majesty, may we present our petition?" "By all means," replied the king. "I am not well enough to receive it in proper state." "Never mind, your majesty. We do not care for much ceremony, and indeed none of us are quite well at present. The subject of our petition weighs upon us." "Go on," said the king. "Sire," began the shadow, "our very existence is in danger. The various sorts of artificial light, both in houses and in men, women, and children, threaten to end our being. The use and the disposition of gas lights, especially high in the centers, blind the eyes by which alone we can be perceived. We are all but banished from towns. We are driven into villages and lonely houses, chiefly old farmhouses, out of which even our friends the fairies are fast disappearing. We therefore petition our king, by the power of his art, to restore us to our rights in the house itself and in the hearts of its inhabitants." "But," said the king, "you frighten the children." "Very seldom, your majesty, and then only for their good. We seldom seek to frighten anybody. We mostly want to make people silent and thoughtful, to awe them a little, your majesty." "You are much more likely to make them laugh," said the king. "Are we?" said the shadow. And approaching the king at one step, he stood quite still for a moment. The diamond of the king's scepter shot out a vivid flame of violet light, and the king stared at the shadow in silence, and his lip quivered. He never told what he saw then, but he would say, "Just fancy what it might be if some flitting thoughts were to persist in staying to be looked at." "It is only," resumed the shadow, "when our thoughts are not fixed upon any particular object, that our bodies are subject to all the vagaries of elemental influences. Generally, amongst worldly men and frivolous women, we only attach ourselves to some article of furniture or of dress, and they never doubt that we are mere foolish and vague results of the dashing of the waves of the light against the solid forms of which their houses are full. We do not care to tell them the truth, for they would never see it. But let the worldly man or the frivolous woman, and then—" At each of the pauses indicated, the mass of shadows throbbed and heaved with emotion, but they soon settled again into comparative stillness. Once more the shadow addressed himself to speak. But suddenly they all looked up, and the king, following their gaze, saw that the aurora had begun to pale. "The moon is rising," said the shadow. "As soon as she looks over the mountains into the valley, we must be gone, for we have plenty to do by the moon. We are powerful in her light. But if your majesty will come here tomorrow night, your majesty may learn a great deal more about us, and judge for himself whether it be fit to accord our petition. For then will our grand annual assembly, in which we report to our chiefs the things we have attempted, and the good or the bad success we have had." "If you send for me," returned the king, "I will come." Ere the shadow could reply, the tip of the moon's crescent horn peeped up from behind an icy pinnacle, and one slender ray fell on the lake. It shone upon no shadows. Ere the eye of the king could again seek the earth after beholding the first brightness of the moon's resurrection, they had vanished, and the surface of the lake glittered cold and blue in the pale moonlight. There the king lay, alone in the midst of the frozen lake, with the moon staring at him, but at length he heard from somewhere a voice that he knew. "Will you take another cup of tea, dear?" said Mrs. Rinkelmann, and Ralph, coming slowly to himself, found that he was lying in his own bed. "Yes, I will," he answered, "and rather a large piece of toast, if you please, for I have been a long journey since I saw you last." "He has not come to himself quite," said Mrs. Rinkelmann between her and herself. "You would be rather surprised," continued Ralph, "if I told you where I had been." "I dare say I should," responded his wife. "Then I will tell you," rejoined Ralph. But at that moment a great shadow bounded out of the fire with a single huge leap and covered the whole room. Then it settled in one corner, and Ralph saw it shaking its fist at him from the end of a preposterous arm. So he took the hint and held his peace, and it was as well for him, for I happen to know something about the shadows too, and I know that if he had told his wife all about it just then, they would not have sent for him the following evening. But as the king, after finishing his tea and toast, lay and looked about him, the shadows dancing in his room seemed to him odder and more inexplicable than ever. The whole chamber was full of mystery. So it generally was, but now it was more mysterious than ever. After all that he had seen in the shadow church, his own room and its shadows were yet more wonderful and unintelligible than those. This made it the more likely that he had seen a true vision, for instead of making common things look commonplace as a false vision would have done, it had made common things disclose the wonderful that was in them. The same applies to all art as well, thought Ralph Rinkelmann. The next afternoon, as the twilight was growing dusky, the king lay wondering whether or not the shadows would fetch him again. He wanted very much to go, for he had enjoyed the journey exceedingly, and he longed besides to hear some of the shadows tell their stories. But the darkness grew deeper and deeper, and the shadows did not come. The cause was that Mrs. Rinkelmann sat by the fire in the gloaming, and they could not carry off the king while she was there. Some of them tried to frighten her away by playing the oddest pranks on the walls, the floor, and ceiling, but altogether without effect. The queen only smiled, for she had a good conscience. Suddenly, however, a dreadful scream was heard from the nursery, and Mrs. Rinkelmann rushed upstairs to see what was the matter. No sooner had she gone than the two warders of the chimney corners stepped out into the middle of the room and said in a low voice, "Is your Majesty ready?" "Have you no hearts?" said the king, "or are they as black as your faces? Did you not hear the child scream? I must know what is the matter with her before I go." "Your Majesty may keep his mind easy on that point," replied the warders. "We had tried everything we could think of to get rid of Her Majesty the Queen, but without effect. So a young madcap shadow, half against the will of the older ones of us, slipped upstairs into the nursery and has, no doubt, succeeded in appalling the baby, for he is very lithe and long-legged. Now, Your Majesty—" "I will have no such tricks played in my nursery," said the king rather angrily. "You might put the child beside itself." "Then there would be twins, Your Majesty, and we rather like twins." "None of your miserable jesting. You might put the child out of her wits." "Impossible, sire, for she has not got into them yet." "Go away," said the king. "Forgive us, Your Majesty. Really it will do the child good, for that shadow will, all her life, be to her a symbol of what is ugly and bad. When she feels in danger of hating or envying anyone, that shadow will come back to her mind and make her shudder." "Very well," said the king. "I like that. Let us go." The shadows went through the same ceremonies and preparations as before, during which the young shadow before mentioned contrived to make grimaces as kept the baby in terror and the queen in the nursery till all was ready. Then, with a bound that doubled him up against the ceiling and a kick crack of his legs 6 feet out behind him, he vanished through the nursery door and reached the king's bedchamber just in time to take his place with the last who were melting through the window in the rear of the litter and settling down upon the snow beneath. Away they went as before, a gliding blackness over the white carpet. And it was Christmas Eve. Thank you for joining me for part 3 of The Shadows. I hope you'll come back next time and find out what happens